Alright, so I got bored again and decided to do an in-depth analysis of a game several years after its release date, because I guess that's just what I do now. You're welcome. Death's Door is a fantastic game, but like most games, it's best experienced completely blind. Because it's more gameplay focused rather than plot driven, it's still possible and actually very easy to enjoy the game even after you've had everything spoiled for you. It'll just be to a lesser extent. If you haven't played the game already, I highly recommend that you do before watching this video. I personally consider it to be one of the best Zelda-like games of all time, and while its main campaign only lasts about 10 hours, it's also only $20, so I'd say it's more than worth it. If you're not sure whether or not you want to get it, then feel free to continue watching this video, but if at any point while watching the game begins to look interesting to you, I encourage you to pause the video and go play the game yourself so that you get the best experience possible. Other than that, I don't have any more disclaimers, so enjoy the video. If you're anything like me, then you absolutely love games that have lots of complexity. Being able to understand and combine dozens of different mechanics all into one working strategy is just so satisfying to me. But sometimes it just gets to be too much. All of the different things that you need to keep track of and manage start piling up, and it all begins to become a bit overwhelming. It's been a long day, and you just want something simple, a game that you can just pick up, start playing, and immediately start having a blast with. And then comes along Death's Door. When it comes to depth over complexity in video games, it's hard for me not to point at Death's Door. Every single mechanic in the game is so simple and intuitive that you could probably show them to someone who's never played a video game in their life and they'd still probably understand it. Yet, despite their simplicity, the mechanics also have a level of depth to them that makes them difficult to master. Its core gameplay loop is so well made that it only needs to add a couple of new mechanics every now and then to keep things fresh. But why? How does Death's Door manage to be so simple, yet so entertaining? Well, there's actually a lot of reasons, most of which are so subtle that most players won't even notice them. But every one of those individual reasons are important in ensuring that the final product is as polished as it is, and I plan to cover all of them. Or at least most of them, you know. So, what better place to start than at the very beginning of the game? As soon as the game starts, one of the first things you'll notice is the UI. It's so simplistic. The only elements present on the HUD are a weapon and two separate bars. This is as complex as the HUD gets for the entire game. It's not cluttered with numbers or statistics, it's simply there so you can just take a quick glance at it and get important information about your character, which is the whole purpose of a HUD. It's not even vital to the game. You could probably cover up this section of the screen and go the entire game without it, and it would only be mildly annoying. The inventory screen, which is combined with the pause menu, is incredibly organized as well. It's just an overall very clean looking menu, and if you're looking for something specific in it, you'll know exactly where to find it. Okay, cool, the developers know basic graphic design, but what about the actual gameplay? That's kind of important. Following the trend of simplicity, the game itself is incredibly easy to understand and starts with an almost non-existent tutorial. It tells you how to move, roll, use your sword, and use your bow. That's it. It doesn't tell you what these things do or how they relate to the UI, it's just left up to the player to find out through experimentation. A good example of this is with the bow. Whenever you use your bow, you'll notice one of the bars in the HUD deplete. Once the bar is empty, you can't use your bow anymore, and it's pretty easy to infer from there that that's your ammo. Small, invisible tutorials like this that show you something rather than tell you are present throughout the entire game. Whenever a new mechanic is introduced, it's given in a safe environment that lets the player experiment with it. The game trusts you to learn about how certain things work on your own rather than just tell you outright. At the end of this incredibly short tutorial section, you'll face the game's first boss. Now, to be honest, this boss is incredibly easy, and it's not too difficult to beat it on your first or second attempt. But I'm fairly certain that this boss's difficulty, or lack thereof, is completely intentional, as the fight is what helps to teach you some of the game's core mechanics. Obviously, you'll try to swing your sword at the boss, and as you do, you'll start to notice a few things. First, you'll notice that your ammo bar fills up with every slash that connects. Then, you'll start to notice red cracks starting to form on the boss, getting more visible the more you attack them. Once again, the player makes an inference from these subtle clues. Hit enemies to refill ammo, and red cracks is their health bar. And all of this happens within like 3 seconds. That's how powerful invisible tutorials are. Eventually, the boss will throw an attack at you where some incredibly thin vines start approaching you very slowly on the ground. Now, you could just walk in the direction that the vines are spinning, but for the more adventurous players, this is a golden opportunity to experiment with the iframes on rolls. Again, this gives the player the opportunity to test some of the game's mechanics in a relatively safe environment. I could go on and on about all of the subtle things that this tutorial section does right, but I think you get the point. This easy boss is able to teach some of the game's core mechanics to the player while still keeping them engaged since, well, you're fighting a boss. I would consider that pretty engaging. And don't be fooled by the simplicity of these mechanics because there's actually a lot of depth to each of them. Starting with the basic sword slash, the depth is actually less from the sword itself and more from the enemies. One of the most important attributes of enemies in this game is that none of them have any collision damage. This means that you can walk into them as much as you want, but you'll only ever take damage if they actually land an attack on you. In turn, the player is able to get up close and personal with each enemy since they don't have to worry about spacing as much, and incentivizes a more aggressive playstyle. However, the game doesn't fully lean into the hack and slash genre, as its lack of needing to space in combat is compensated for by making the player worry about the enemy even as they're attacking them. Another thing that enemies in this game lack is a stagger system. With one exception, enemies in this game will never stop their attack animation unless they die. This means that you can't just mindlessly spam the attack button on an enemy because they'll just tank through your hits and attack you back. This forces the player to constantly be aware of what attack phase the enemy they're fighting is currently on, creating a basic combat loop of hitting an enemy, dodging their attack, and repeating. One additional mechanic that helps to make this loop feel more fluid is rolling. Rolling acts as a method to quickly move a short amount of distance, making it perfect for dodging enemy attacks, but I'm sure you already knew that. However, whenever you roll, you're also given a subtle choice between two options, rolling towards the enemy or rolling away from them. Rolling towards the enemy is pretty risky since you're putting yourself in a situation where it's easier to get hit, but it becomes a more viable option thanks to the iframes on rolls previously mentioned. If you don't feel like risking taking a hit, you can also roll away from the enemy, which is much safer but won't let you deal as much damage since you either need to roll back to them or use your bow. Speaking of which, the bow allows you to safely attack enemies at a distance, albeit for slightly less damage. Projectile weapons are one of those things that are incredibly difficult to balance because you don't want them to feel too weak, but you also don't want players to be able to just camp in a corner using them. Thankfully, Death's Door has a perfect solution to this. This second bar in your HUD below your health is for your ammo, and it can only be refilled by attacking enemies with your melee weapon. This is a brilliant solution because it prevents the player from just spamming arrows in the corner, as they'll eventually have to use their melee weapon to refill their ammo. And because ammo is more scarce, the developers are able to add more power to the bow and make each arrow feel like it has an actual impact. The combination of these mechanics creates a combat system that feels incredibly fluid and gives you plenty of options to approach enemies. You can be really aggressive and utilize invincibility from rolls to quickly dodge attacks and keep your DPS up. You can be more passive and attack from afar using your bow, only approaching the enemy to get a few hits in and refill your ammo, or do a mix of the two. All of these options are almost equal in viability, and because the enemies never stagger, you'll still need to pay attention to their attack patterns no matter what you do. That being said, the enemies in this game aren't particularly challenging to fight individually. Most of the difficulty when fighting them comes from the sheer amount of them you have to face. Oftentimes, they're placed in large groups, forcing the player to focus on several different enemies while they're fighting. Now, adding more things the player has to pay attention to may seem to go against the core idea of Death's Door, but I would say that in this scenario, it's actually executed pretty well. Most enemies have a pretty short attack range and need to get pretty close to you if they want to actually deal damage. Because of this, you can mostly ignore enemies that aren't directly in front of you, only needing to worry about them once they get closer. Of course, there are enemies with projectiles, which pose more of a problem, but these projectiles usually move at a fairly slow speed, giving you plenty of time to react to them. However, designing the enemies in a way so that they're supposed to be fought in large numbers has its drawbacks. The most obvious problem is that whenever you have to face just one or two of them, they end up being a huge pushover. All of their attacks are way too slow to be of any threat to you, and their health bar is pretty much non-existent. While this doesn't apply to things like mini-bosses, it can make fighting random enemies in the overworld feel a bit too easy. It's not a huge problem, especially since it lets you learn their attack patterns before you have to face hordes of them, but I can't just not mention it. And wow, I talked for quite a while about the game's combat. But as you probably already know, combat isn't the only thing this game has to offer. When it comes to the exploration aspect of Death's Door, I can safely say that the game handles it incredibly well. The game's map is divided into 4 different areas. The central area is decently sized and connects to the other three, acting as a sort of hub world. There's also an actual hub world used for warping around, but I'll talk about that more later. Each of the three areas connecting to the center contains a sizable sub-area that's focused on exploration, a dungeon focused on puzzles, a small sub-area focused on fighting hordes of enemies, and a boss. When it comes to the theming of these sub-areas, this game does exactly what Hollow Knight does, and by that I mean that the first area in the game is incredibly bland looking, and while it is tastefully done, especially given the context, you can't help but think to yourself, man, this is cool and all, but I hope the entire game doesn't look like this. And then you play a bit more and then... every single area in this game feels wholly unique from the others. You could be visiting a seaport town, climbing a mountain during a raging snowstorm, wandering a peaceful garden. The variety presented here makes unlocking a new area a joy because you never know where you're gonna go next. Littered throughout the world while you explore are a bunch of different collectibles, such as life seeds, masses of soul energy, shiny things, and shrines. One thing to note about exploration is that the camera is always locked in an isometric view. Now, even though this was probably just a stylistic choice, the isometric camera angle also has a ton of benefits that the game takes full advantage of. There's a bunch of secret paths that utilize the camera angle in a way that makes them relatively hidden while still not being obnoxiously difficult to find. The fixed camera angle also helps exploration feel a lot more fair than it does in 3D games. Everything that you need to see is always on the screen, so you don't have to worry about constantly turning your camera so that you don't miss anything. Each area generally introduces a few unique enemies as well as some stronger variants of enemies faced in previous areas. I would say that especially for an indie game, there's actually a pretty good amount of enemy variety, especially for an why did I put that twice in the script? There's a good amount of enemy variety, especially for an indie game. However, I do feel like you face them ever so slightly too often. Don't get me wrong, fighting enemies is incredibly fun, and the combat in this game is amazing, but sometimes they can get in the way of exploring. But that's just a very slight nitpick of mine, since the enemy placement in this game is usually pretty balanced. And who knows, maybe it's just a skill issue. Besides having just a bit too many enemies, one of the main problems I have with exploration is the movement. I've already talked about how nice it is to have the option to roll when fighting enemies, but outside of combat it becomes really annoying because rolling is undeniably the fastest way to travel in this game. I mean, sure, you could just walk everywhere, but why do that when you can get to your location faster by constantly rolling? This then becomes the Zelda-like lose-lose situation where you either get to your location faster, but have to deal with the annoyingness that is spamming a button, or walk normally while knowing that it's suboptimal and you could get to your location faster if you really wanted to. Again, this is just a bit of a nitpick, but just because I love this game doesn't mean I can't acknowledge its flaws. It just becomes a chore whenever you have to backtrack through an area after you've already solved all the puzzles because you're either being suboptimal or spamming a roll button. Oh yeah, speaking of which, the puzzles. Puzzles are placed everywhere throughout the world, and are nice ways to add a challenge to exploration and keep it interesting. Because the game isn't incredibly complex, the puzzles are usually pretty simple, yet they're not too easy. The developers make sure that the puzzles utilize the game mechanics to the fullest, requiring the player to have full understanding of how they work in order to solve them. Because of this, they manage to hit this nice sweet spot of being simple and interesting, while still not being so easy that it's boring. And if puzzles along the main path are too easy for you, then you can also solve the puzzles leading to shrines and shiny things, which are almost all brilliantly designed. Take this puzzle in the ceramic manor, for example. Throughout the dungeon, or house, I guess, whatever, throughout this area are locked doors that can only be unlocked by destroying all of the glowing pots in the room. However, there is this one room that seems to be a complete dead end when you enter it. Now, anyone who's ever played a good Zelda-like will immediately realize that there's no such thing as a useless room in a dungeon, and will start to investigate it more thoroughly. If you look close enough, you can see that there are actually glowing pots in the room, but they're only visible on the reflection of the floor. Attacking all the areas where the pots appear to be reflecting from will cause an invisible door to open, leading to a shrine. Little secrets like these hidden throughout the world help to make exploring both fun and rewarding. Of course, even with distinct areas and clever puzzles, the world would still feel a bit empty without NPCs, and I have to give it to the game, every NPC feels wholly unique. Each of them have their own distinct designs and personalities, like Barb the Bard, or Pothead, or Jefferson, who is definitely not an octopus controlling a human corpse. Even the bosses have distinct personalities. In fact, most of them will talk to you midway throughout the dungeons, letting you get to know them before you even fight them. Speaking of which, let's talk about the design of the dungeons. They pretty much all follow a formula similar to that of a typical Zelda dungeon. There will be a big door somewhere near the center of the dungeon, and in rooms towards the edge of the dungeon, which are blocked by puzzles, there will be small fights with enemies that'll let you find the soul of a crow. Once you find all the crow souls, the big door will open and you get to fight a horde of enemies in a fight known as an avarice fight. After the horde, you get a unique item which lets you access areas that were previously inaccessible in the dungeon, as well as the next sub-area. In this sub-area, you'll go through a long section that utilizes said item while fighting waves of enemies. Then, once you get past this long section, you finally fight the boss. Now, that's a heavily summarized version of the dungeons, but it's still pretty accurate. What helps these dungeons stand out from each other is their design, both visually and gameplay-wise. The first dungeon, the Ceramic Manor, is incredibly linear and has very few branching paths. Each one of the rooms in it feels self-contained, and by that I mean that as soon as you enter a room, you're confident that you can get through it without having to backtrack at all. The furnace section that you go through after unlocking the fireball is also pretty cool, especially since all of the pistons move in sync with the music. The Mushroom Dungeon is a more maze-like dungeon, and involves you visiting rooms you've already been in before a couple of times. You really need a good sense of the dungeon layout in order to complete it without having to wander around aimlessly. Plus, it even combines parts of the overworld with the dungeon, which is a nice touch. Once you get the dungeon item, the Flooded Fortress section right after it manages to completely change the entire feeling of the dungeon while still somehow matching the rest of the dungeon thematically. The final dungeon, Castle Lockstone, goes all in on the central room idea and will have you enter other rooms to slowly power a central elevator to get to the next section, kinda like the Forest Temple from Ocarina of Time. Wait, that's like the 5th time I've mentioned Zelda. The whole section with the old watchtowers right afterwards is probably one of my favorite sections in the entire game. Everything from the music, the atmosphere, and the pacing is just incredibly well executed. I hate to use this phrasing, but it really does make you feel like you're fighting against the forces of nature to ascend the mountain. The items you receive from these dungeons, while they may be fairly basic, still manage to feel distinct from one another and have their own unique uses. Use the fireball to burn things, bombs to blow things up, and hookshot to cross gaps, kinda like another item from an unnamed series. Not only that, but they all have different applications in combat as well. The fireball can be used to hit enemies that are lined up, the bomb can be used to wipe out clusters of enemies, and then there's my personal favorite, the hookshot, which pulls you towards the enemy you use it on, allowing for a very aggressive playstyle. These items can also have their viability in combat be upgraded via secret areas in the overworld which require their respective items to access. I gotta say, on paper, this is a great idea. I absolutely love it when games let you get upgraded versions of items you already own, and hidden areas can really help to improve the exploration aspect of the game. But unfortunately, in execution, it's just not actually that good. I said earlier that one of the main problems with exploration is the movement, but the main problem I have with exploration is just how many item-locked secrets there are. What the game wants to happen is something like this. The player sees something interesting, like this shining web in this cave, and after some failed attempts of trying to get rid of it, just shrug it off as something that they have to come back to later. Then, once they get the fireball and use it to burn webs in the Ceramic Manor, they'll realize, oh wait, there was a web earlier in the cave by the Lost Cemetery, I should go there later and explore. This is a great utilization of a concept called recontextualization, where players are able to go to old areas under a new context and find some new secrets. And don't get me wrong, this is a good thing. Areas should remain intriguing to the player even after they've gone through it once. However, this fails in Death's Door because there are too many secrets that the player has to just come back to later. It's hard to remember that there was a web in the cave leading to the estate of the Ernwich when you also have to remember that there's another web that can be burned in the central area of the Lost Cemetery, and also a bombable wall by the warp door in the estate of the Ernwich, which is right next to several hookshot points. Oh, and don't forget that there's another bombable wall beneath the bridge in the Lost Cemetery, and also whatever's going on near the Stranded Sailor, and so much more. These item-locked secrets are just too abundant, and most of them only lead to masses of soul energy or life seeds, which is a very small reward compared to the amount of time spent backtracking to it. The player is overloaded with too much information, and if they do manage to remember areas to come back to, they're given too little of a reward. Had there only been the item upgrades and maybe just one hidden seed per area that requires an item the player doesn't already have, players would be more likely to remember them and have a more convincing incentive to come back for them later. The one area that does this properly is the Hall of Doors. Now, I neglected to talk about this earlier, but I absolutely love the Hall of Doors. I personally think that the black and white aesthetic is very tastefully done, and also thematically matches the area it's used in. But when it comes to gameplay, I don't think that it could have done any better than it already has. You see, the big doors in each of the dungeons actually lead you to the Hall of Doors, which is where the Avarice fights are located. Once you complete the Avarice fight and get a new item, you then have to use the item to escape that area and make your way back to the central area of the Hall of Doors so that you can warp back to the dungeon. It's a good way of teaching the player how the item works, and since the player is already in the Hall of Doors, they'll be more encouraged to explore the area. After all, if they've just used their bombs to blow up some walls and noticed another wall in the corner, they may as well go check it out. If players do explore the Hall of Doors, they'll usually be rewarded with some soul energy, a shiny thing, and a bit of lore. Because the Hall of Doors acts as the hub world that players will come back to several times anyways, it acts as the perfect place to put item-locked secrets. I guess that this kinda also works for the Lost Cemetery since you have to go back there to get to the new areas, but it becomes too much of a hassle going back to item-locked paths due to the size of the cemetery. And also, I guess since I'm already criticizing some of the game's flaws, it's about time I mention what I believe to be the worst designed mechanic in the game: Soul and Seed Collection. Whenever you kill an enemy, you gain some soul energy. Usually, you'll only gain 1 or 2 soul energy every time you kill an enemy, only gaining large amounts after felling great enemies such as bosses. You can also gain soul energy by picking up the masses of soul energy scattered in hidden spots throughout the world. Once you have enough soul energy, you can spend it to upgrade your stats such as dexterity, strength, or haste at the Soul Vault. Hey wait, this mechanic seems kind of familiar. This mechanic is supposed to give an incentive to not only killing enemies, but also exploring the world, as it'll make your character stronger and make fights easier. I would consider that pretty good design. The only problem is that while enemies usually give you 1 to 2 soul energy, each mass of soul energy you pick up gives you 100 soul energy. 100 soul energy. That's like 50 to 80 enemies worth of soul energy. And even though you encounter enemies pretty often, there are dozens upon dozens of masses of soul energy scattered throughout the world, effectively removing any sense of reward for killing enemies. Because of this, the only incentive you have left to fight enemies is for the sheer fun of it, which, I mean, good job to the developers because fighting enemies is pretty fun, but that doesn't fix the problem. Okay, but let's just say that we can completely ignore soul energy gained from enemies. They can just be seen as a small little touch the game adds to add more world building. But if you're a completionist like me, you'll want to get every upgrade in the game, which means maxing out all of your stats. Unfortunately, there isn't even close to enough masses of soul energy scattered around the world to max out all of your stats. Now, it is not bad game design to prevent players from maxing out all of their stats. In fact, I would say that this is actually really good game design since it encourages players to pick upgrades that support their own personal playstyle. But the problem is that this is never clearly communicated to the player, meaning you could start upgrading a stat at the beginning of the game, realize that you probably should have started upgrading a different stat first later on, but then be prevented from upgrading said stat because it's impossible to get enough soul energy to do so. Granted, the upgrades you get at the Soul Vault don't affect gameplay too much, but it can still be pretty disheartening once you realize that it's impossible to change your build. Now, when I said the worst design mechanic, I also mentioned seeds, not just soul energy. I absolutely love the idea of life seeds in this game. Just like masses of soul energy, seeds are spread throughout areas in the game, but instead of being used to upgrade stats, they're used to heal yourself. Other than entering the Hall of Doors, which is a warp area, there is no other way to heal in this game other than seeds. Throughout the game, you'll see seed pots you can plant seeds in. Interacting with one of these pots will consume a seed and permanently plant a flower. Interacting with these flowers will consume them and heal you to full health, only regrowing if you die or leave the area. This means that whenever you pass by a pot, you're burdened with the decision of, do I plant my seed here and make this my healing spot, or save it for later and plant it in a pot further along? It creates this whole system of risk and reward, making your health a much more complex resource to manage. This right here is phenomenal game design. But the seed system gets so close to greatness but falls just a bit short because of the same flaws the soul energy system has. There's too many seeds throughout the world. Seeds are extremely easy to come across when exploring, and as long as you're not planting them in literally every pot you see, you'll always have more than enough seeds to plant one if you're a bit low on health, completely ruining the whole risk-reward system of pots. So, how could these two problems be fixed? First off, the most important thing that needs to happen is that they both need to become a more scarce resource. If the player's not running into them every minute, they become more valuable of a resource and will feel really impactful when you encounter them. Then, I would completely swap how seeds and soul energy work. Killing enemies can drop some sort of currency when you kill them, which can then be used to buy seeds, which slowly become more expensive as time goes on. This gives the player a legitimate incentive to fight enemies, while also preventing them from snowballing by getting a bunch of soul energy from killing enemies, using it to upgrade stats, and then killing more enemies even faster with their newly upgraded stats. Masses of soul energy can still be spread around the world, albeit a lot more scarce as previously mentioned. Only a select few of them should be hidden in item-locked areas, so the player is still encouraged to explore areas to the fullest the first time they enter them, rather than just blaze through them as fast as they can and only return to explore once they have all the items. You could also get a mass of soul energy from defeating a boss as well, because why not? These masses of soul energy could be exchanged directly for upgrades to your stats, getting more and more expensive as time goes on. Players can still be locked out of maxing out all of their stats, but it'll be clearly communicated to them at the beginning of the game. By making these changes, you can improve the risk-reward system of seeds, incentivize fighting enemies, make exploring feel more impactful, and make 100%ing the game more fun. Is this a perfect solution? Probably not. I came up with it in like 30 minutes, among other ideas such as making individual enemies only drop soul energy the first time they're killed. But I still believe that it would help to greatly improve one of the game's biggest flaws. Okay, now that we're done with that tangent, let's get back to praising the game, because despite its shortcomings in souls and seeds, it's still fundamentally incredible. For example, its unique weapons. You start the game out with one weapon, but throughout the game you're able to obtain up to 5. There's the standard Reaper sword for, well, standard combat, the daggers for more fast-paced combat, and the hammer for more slow and analytical combat. There's also the greatsword, which is basically a bonus weapon since you have to do a pretty long quest towards the end of the game to get it, and the umbrella, which is very obviously a challenge weapon since it's just the Reaper sword, but much worse. The nice thing about these weapons is that, aside from the umbrella and greatsword, none of them are obviously better than one another. These weapons simply allow for different playstyles and ways for approaching enemies, adding even more depth and variety to the game. And then we get to the music, and oh my, wow, the music is good. I'm a huge sucker for games with orchestral music, and Death's Door definitely delivers. It's able to combine the elegance of orchestral music with the curiosity of exploration and the intensity of battle music, partially thanks to its incorporation of dynamic music. Right now, you're listening to the theme for Castle Lockstone, but once you start fighting a horde of enemies, it changes to a different, more intense version, like this. There's also dynamic music for areas like the Stranded Sailor and Overgrown Ruins, which change to match the area you're currently in, like so. Pretty much every single track in the game is a joy to listen to, and I have to commend David Fenn for his composition skills. Also, he manages to create some really unique tracks that still somehow manage to fit right in, such as the boss fight theme for the Grey Crow, which almost exclusively uses the piano. Speaking of which, let's go ahead and analyze the bosses in this game. Each one of them has a unique way in which they attack the player, forcing them to all be approached in different ways. The first boss, aside from the tutorial boss, and also this guy who I completely forgot about while writing the script, is the Urn Witch. When you're fighting her, she's not actually too threatening up close. Her main method of attack is projectiles, which you'll have to constantly dodge while catching her teleporting around. It's a great boss for teaching you how to deal with many different things on the screen at once, which you will encounter a lot in this game. The next boss is the Frog King. He's honestly kind of mid in terms of combat, but he does have a really cool concept. His attacks break the floor tiles beneath you, and in order to bring them back, you have to hit the tip of his weapon. This is really clever because his weapon is made out of the same switch that's used to restore the floor in puzzles earlier. I do wish that you could only hit his weapon if you dealt enough damage to him so that you would be prevented from turtling through the fight, but that's just a small nitpick. And then there's Betty. Compared to the bosses before, Betty is a huge step up in difficulty. The other two bosses before had some sort of gimmick to their fight, like non-stop projectiles or a disappearing floor. Betty's gimmick is that she hits you, and believe me when I say she is really good at doing so. Betty's attacks are some of the fastest in the game and require you to have some really quick reaction times. Additionally, you can't just wail on her between attacks like the other bosses because she gives you no breaks. The cooldown between her attacks is basically non-existent, forcing you to constantly pay attention to what attack she's doing, sneaking in a few hits whenever you can. She's one of the most simplistic, yet most well-designed bosses in the game, which is pretty fitting for the final dungeon. After you beat the 3 dungeons and their bosses, you enter the endgame, which is basically just all boss fights. First, there's the Grey Crow, which is probably my favorite boss in the entire game. Just like Betty, the Grey Crow is really fast, but in a different way. Most of his speed is focused into his actual movement rather than his attacks. This means that unlike Betty, where you wait for the perfect time to strike her and then quickly dodge out of the way, the Grey Crow has you constantly trying to inch closer to him while still worrying about his own attacks at the same time. Every time you do manage to land a hit on him, small crows made of ink will spawn and slowly move towards you. They're really not that strong, but they do prevent you from snowballing through the fight, since the more you attack him, the more of them you have to deal with. This boss also has a really nice aesthetic, with a fight theme that consists almost entirely of the piano, and having a completely black and white color palette for pretty much everything on the screen, aside from some basic UI elements and weapons. I love the Grey Crow, and that's only the penultimate boss fight. If the Grey Crow is so good, then how good is the actual final boss? Surely it has to be an incredible fight, right? Well, not exactly. Looks like we're back to complaining, criticizing the game, because we're going to talk about the Lord of Doors. Thematically speaking, this boss is actually pretty good. It's nothing crazy, but you fight a character that you've seen and heard about throughout the entire game, and the whole idea behind the Lord of Doors, where he has access to every single location, is really cool as well. The fight starts off pretty promisingly by taking place in the Hall of Doors. That's great, more recontextualization for the Hall of Doors. But then you get about 15 seconds into the fight and you realize, wait a second, this guy only has 2 attacks and they're both terrible. In his main attack, he jumps up and punches the ground, which is both boring and uncreative. If this were one of the attacks that he only sometimes throws out if you're really close to him, then I would have no problem with it. But I do have a problem with it because this is the final boss and that's pretty much all he does. Well, not actually. He has another where he summons a bunch of doors which then charge towards you, which is actually pretty good. However, it gets slow and repetitive very quickly since it makes up 50% of his moveset. After you fight him for about a minute, he retreats through a door and you enter this running section where you chase him, before eventually entering another door. Once you go through this door, you enter the estate of the Urnwitch and start fighting him there. Okay, wait, never mind, that's actually pretty cool. I might like this boss now. You get ready to observe his new moveset in this new location, and then he just jumps and punches again. This happens for each of the 3 main areas in the game, and while it feels cool in concept, it's incredibly boring since he does the same thing in every single location. Okay, that's not entirely accurate. He does have one unique special move in each area, but they're once again very easy to dodge, especially after you just fought the Grey Crow. Plus, the moves don't even get added onto each other. He only ever uses the door attack in the Hall of Doors, throws pots at you in the estate of the Urnwitch, and so on. Other than his joke of a moveset, his fight doesn't quite flow properly either. The running sections in between each combat break up the pace way too much, and it makes it so that both the combat and running sections feel way too short. I get that since he's the Lord of Doors, his whole thing is being able to transport everywhere, but it just feels too slow-paced. What would have been better is if all of the running sections were combined with each other and placed right before the fight. Then, during the actual fight, he has his full moveset from all of the locations. Additionally, he could do things like summon a door that sucks both of you in and transport you to a new arena, allowing you to keep the theme of revisiting old areas. In the original fight, once you get past the last running section, you enter his final phase, where his moveset is mainly just all of his previous moves combined, along with 2 really easy to dodge moves. Granted, these moves are incredibly cinematic, but they're a bit lacking in terms of difficulty. Whenever I fight the Lord of Doors, I can't help but feel like the fight was kind of rushed. The developers took the whole doors idea, and rather than adapting attacks to match other areas, they basically just copy-pasted attacks from a few of the other bosses. Nevertheless, he is a boss in this game, and I have to talk about him. The Grey Crow probably would have been a better boss to end on so you don't enter the post-game with a bad taste in your mouth, but it's whatever. Oh yeah, the post-game. I should probably talk about that too. I have mixed feelings about this post-game. Let's start off with the good parts. After you beat the game, you gain access to this bell tower, which you can use to activate nighttime. During nighttime, almost every enemy in the game despawns. I would consider this a pretty good inclusion. If the player wants to 100% the game and explore every corner of the world, they have the option to disable enemies so they can focus more on discovering secrets that they missed. Another neat inclusion is the change to the Hall of Doors. Normally, this place is a pretty well organized hub world, but since you've already overthrown the Lord of Doors, there's no one around to maintain it. It's just a nice little bit of world building. Additionally, certain warp doors in the Hall of Doors will begin glowing red. It's not exactly clear to the player what this means, but through some experimentation, they'll figure out that if a door is glowing red, they haven't 100%ed that area yet. Both of these features save so much time for completionists like myself, and I'm really glad the developers put them in. Now onto the parts I don't like. There's actually a secret ending you can only unlock in the post-game, and it takes a few steps to get to. First, let me be clear, I think it's perfectly acceptable for games to have secret endings that can only be unlocked post-game, they just need to be done well. The way that Death's Door has you unlock its secret ending is by collecting 7 tablets around the world after you beat the final boss. Okay, that's still a pretty cool idea, adding more content for the player and all, except most of it is just walking simulators. Out of the 7 tablets you need to get, 5 of them mostly consist of you walking around looking for stuff. There's the one where you have to find all of the life seeds, which I'm actually fine with, but then there's the one where you have to find a bunch of ghosts, one where you find a bunch of owls, one where you walk from one side of the map to the other, and one where you walk around looking for torches. All of those missions are incredibly boring and add very little to the game. I mean, I guess they require you to have knowledge of the map, but that's really the only upside I can think of. And then there's the 7th tablet. This one confuses me so much. If you go to the top of the old watchtowers during nighttime, you get a special shiny thing that once belonged to the gravedigger. If you then return to him with the shiny thing, you get a cutscene and then enter a boss fight against him. Yes, an entire boss fight that's only accessible in the post-game. Except, compared to the bosses you had to beat before reaching this one, this boss is actually really easy. I'm not trying to flex or anything, but when I replayed this game for footage, I beat him basically hitless on my first try, something that I didn't even come close to doing with the Grey Crow. It's just a bit disappointing knowing that the developers spent all of this time creating a boss fight that you can only fight after you've beaten the final boss that's both incredibly easy and grouped with all of the walking simulators. But if you manage to get all 7 tablets, you can head to the camp of the Free Crows and use the tablets you gathered to open a door that leads you to a special area. Once you enter this special area, you get a cutscene explaining some lore, and then that's it. Hold on, you're telling me I spent 4 hours playing walking simulators in a game that's already only 9 for a cutscene? It's not even that crazy of a cutscene, it just shows you a bit of extra lore. And look, I get that this cutscene is a reference to Acid Nerve's previous game, which is pretty cool to be honest, but to most players, this post-game will just end up feeling like a massive waste of time. So, how do you fix this post-game? Here's my proposal. First and foremost, all of the walking simulators need to be removed, or at the very least, don't make them required to open the door. In order to actually open the door, you should need to go through a quest that involves collecting every shiny thing in the game. And you know what? You can even keep the requirement of getting all of the seeds, especially if you go through with the rework I talked about earlier. After you get all of the shiny things, you face the Gravedigger as one last bonus boss, except he's much harder than he is in his current state. He's supposed to only be found by players who put a lot of time into the game, so it only makes sense for him to be extremely difficult. By doing this, the post-game actually becomes fun for those who care about the game, and makes playing it its own reward. The cutscene at the end can stay the same, it'll just be a nice little bonus for Acid Nerve fans. And if you don't like that idea, then you can lean fully into the whole understand the layout of the entire map idea and create some sort of ARG. Those are always neat. And And with that, we reach the end of Death's Door. Looking back at this script, I seem to critique the game way too much compared to how much I praised it, which, while still valid, can give the impression that I hate this game, which I absolutely don't. So, just to balance things out and make it so that I don't end on a bad note, here's a lightning round of neat little details in the game. If you cut a sign in half, it'll look like this when you try to read it. These rolling enemies can push each other off of the map, making them the only enemies who can kill each other as far as I'm aware. The Overgrown Ruins is closed off by a large door when you first enter it, adding just an extra bit of world building. If you eat Jefferson's soup, it'll actually heal you to full health. The gravedigger's name is 𝘳𝘦𝘺𝘺. Freakin' 𝘳𝘦𝘺. The names for the previous Lord of Doors are all puns, like Theodore. This game really likes puns. Whenever you defeat the last enemy in a horde fight, it'll do a zoom in effect and change up the music a bit. The screen is ever so slightly tinted red around the borders when you have 1 health left. All of the items have different colors that give them more distinction from each other. And finally, if you talk to Grunt enough times, he'll say, "Love, laugh, live," which is kinda funny. Overall, while Death's Door may have a few shortcomings in its seed and soul system, as well as its post-game content, it's otherwise a fantastic video game. It does basically everything perfectly, aside from those few things I mentioned. It may not be a very complex game, but that's because it's not supposed to be. Its combat has a perfect feeling of fluidity to it, where it's easy to learn but hard to master. Its puzzles hit the sweet spot of challenging the player to think, but not overwhelming them with new information. And most importantly, rather than focusing on adding complex mechanics, the developers take the core mechanics of the game and refine them to mastery. Death's Door may not be a very complex game, it may not be a game with the most replay value, and it is far from being a perfect game, but it's designed well. Its simplicity and refinement of its core mechanics make it stand out from other games I know, and out of every indie game I've ever played, Death's Door is by far the most elegant of them all. Wait, hold on, you're saying that there's another game just like this one? Well shoot, now I gotta spend $30 and do an analysis on that one too.